I believe, and I'm going to take SLD kids. SLD kids are the best example because they're the highest incident of disabilities. The epidemiological rates for SLD kids is 4 to 5%, meaning that anything above that, you either have something very unusual in your school district, you're along a bad river where the water comes from, something, but the epidemiological rate for SLD is not above 5%. So, 4 to 5%. So when the special ed laws were originally done in 1975 and redone as late as 2006 for the regulations, you know, and the state people know, that the target cap for percent of kids in a state who are disabled is 12%. It's always been 12%. That's based on the epidemiological rates of each of those disabilities. SLD was originally at 4%. That's 33% of the 12%. It's the biggest one. That's why it's called a high incidence disability. Anything above 4 or 5%, you're either having placement decisions that are a result of a pity party for the kid, a parent demand, or there was an attorney at the meeting. Or you're in a school where the only game in town is special ed. There's no other reason for it. But here's the sad fact. National longitudinal data that's collected every 2 years to look at outcomes for kids in schools targets kids with disabilities and targets SLD kids in particular. Doug Fuchs reported not too long ago that 57% of kids enrolled in SLD programs in public schools were unemployed 1 year post-secondary, whatever that means. Whether it's out of high school, out of community college, unemployed. 57%. I don't know what your district is, but your state and every other state's data on the percent of students with disabilities making proficiency hovers around 30%. That is totally and completely unacceptable, and it's morally disgraceful. And the issue is, well, they're kids with disabilities. What do you expect? Every SLD kid, every EBD kid can attain state-approved grade-level standards, hands down. So why aren't they? So there's a couple of reasons. One is because our instruction in special education is not aligned with state-approved grade-level standards upon which the tests are based. We're working hard, we're not working smart. So we're going to talk about that. The second is that we tend to not integrate special ed instruction with the scope, sequence, and pacing of the general ed instruction. We're in a silo. If those two things are modified, your kids in special ed, their performance on high-stakes tests will jump. It will jump significantly. So the shift and the memo that came out in November was intended to emphasize that IEPs should not have target goals tied to assessments. You don't give the dibbles and say the kid's poor fluency, and so we're going to focus on increasing fluency. There is no standard for fluency anymore. Fluency is not words correct per minute. In all the standards, fluency is defined as a reading rate necessary to sustain comprehension for the grade level standard. That's what it is. I had a question yesterday. How do we write an IEP goal for a 10th grader reading at the 3rd grade level? Is it a 10th grade standard or a 3rd grade standard? I was so shocked by the question. I hoped my body language did not communicate that. Absolutely, it's the 10th grade standard. If the kid can't access the content because of a fluency issue, fix it with text-to-speech. Fix it with something. But those skills do not represent thinking. The standards are focused toward critical thinking, reasoning, and problem solving. There's no discrete skills in any standards anymore. So there's no reason why a 10th grade kid can't meet the comprehension standard for 10th grade just because they can't read words. And I didn't say this, but I'm saying it to you because I'm putting context because I was prepared to address this issue. What do you do with a blind kid? Are you going to force the kid's head down and go, read, read? That's ridiculous. So dyslexia back in the day, Strauss and Lettinen were the two people who really kind of identified learning disabilities before any of you were born. It used to be called word blindness. These are for kids who could see, but it's like they can't see the word. It's a form of blindness. Remember this, for every word a kid can't read to you, I will bet you $100 that the kid has the word in their verbal vocabulary. So they can't read the word apple. They don't go into the cafeteria and say, I want one of those, I want one of them round things that you bite. Yes, I want an apple. You show them the word apple, what does that mean? I have no clue. So this is not a knowledge loss. They just can't read the words. It is a frickin' disability in reading words, not in thinking. So we're going to talk in a moment about universal design for learning, and we're going to talk about it in terms of strategies. So, and unpacking standards. So for IEPs, we take the standard. We unpack it in terms of the know, understand, and do. Nouns are what kids have to know, verbs are how they have to do it. And then we say what the access skills are to those issues. So an access skill would be fluency to comprehension, right? What's the other building block for comprehension besides fluency? Vocabulary. The two building blocks. So fluency and vocabulary. If a kid's not fluent, so be it. How do we get the words into the kid's head so that they have access to the content? And by the way, there's no standard that says how the kid has to get the information or how the kid has to demonstrate it. They use words like recount. Well, you can recount by telling it, you can recount by writing it, you can recount by drawing a picture of it. So I hope that we're moving away from IEPs that are skill-focused, that are blind to the standard that the kid is expected to achieve for that grade level. So I would have to have a really, really good reason to ever deviate from grade level standards for a kid with a disability. My job is to figure out how to get access to the content so the kid's thinking does well. Does that make sense? But man, is that going to be a battle in your IEP meetings? Absolutely. So I'm not throwing you under the bus. I'm just asking you to have in your head what we all know we have to do to get these kids able to demonstrate grade level standards and not let their disability be a barrier to that. So specially designed instruction, we're going to talk about that, is instruction that reduces or eliminates a barrier caused by a disability. A kid with dyslexia. Intensive instruction, and you don't have to write this down, it's later on. Intensive instruction is instruction that is designed to reduce or eliminate a barrier caused not by a disability. So let's take a kid from an impoverished background who has not had exposure to reading words. They have not been able to develop automaticity. That is a practice issue. But all you do is increase the amount of instruction in the area that the kid is weak. There's no disability. The kid will respond to that intensive instruction. A kid who has dyslexia will not. So specially designed instruction is instruction that is evidence-based for kids who have that deficit, who have a disability, as opposed to kids who've moved around a lot, kids who, for a variety of other reasons. Does that make sense to you? Absolutely. So remember that. The difference between a 504 plan and being in special ed is not the presence or absence of a disability. All 504 kids have a disability. What they don't need is specially designed instruction. They need accommodations. You can't be a special ed kid unless you have a disability and you have a demonstrated need for specially designed instruction. Both have disabilities. One's in special ed, one's in not. So if we can accommodate for a kid, so if I were a parent of a 9th grader who was reading at the 3rd grade level, probably after I got over suing the school district for the kid being there all those years, everybody knowing it, and the kid being in 9th grade for being a low-hanging fruit when it comes to reading, I would say, look, my kid can think. I don't want my kid denied access to the curriculum anymore because we're trying to pound a rock that won't break. That kid is never going to read fast enough to match the content. I want to find some way. I want to terminate special ed. I want my kid in a 504 kid, and I want to use universal design for learning and technology to bypass that kid's disability and stop trying with 6 years the kid's been in special ed and is only third grade level. And look how much time you've taken to do that when we could have been having time for that kid to excel in other areas. It's kind of like, cut curbs. If we didn't have cut curbs, a poor person in a wheelchair has to be really good at jumping curbs with a wheelchair, which might be fun. It's a skill that could be acquired, but it takes a lot of time. So we don't have noise things that go push, push. We cut the curb, bypass the issue, and the person's up to access whatever's on the sidewalk. We do this in real life. But man, we get anal retentive when it comes to IEPs with kids who have these basic skills that a disability, we don't have a lot of highly effective interventions for getting rid of. How many of you work with Orton-Gillingham method? How many of you work with dyslexics? You know what a slow row to hoe that is. Kids make progress, but they don't ever close the gap. And all that time, they're probably able to understand the material they can't read. So that's a conversation. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
So I actually have two questions because another one
Uh-oh.
you were talking about.
Well, see what the first one is before. The second one, you may have to pay for the second one.
The standards base.
Yes.
My issue is that some of my kids, obviously standards build on each other.
They do.
So some of my students, and I'm a speech therapist, so some of my students really need a standard that, say, is in the second grade standards, but they're really fourth grade, but they're not ready for the fourth grade.
Yes.
So is there
Can I
anything
show
wrong
you
with-
something in a moment about that?
Okay.
Yes, I totally get. You're absolutely right.
And then my other question, what you just said about a 504.
Can you hear her? Okay.
I thought I was pretty loud. I'm a
You
speech
are.
therapist.
That's good. I just wanted to check.
So then my other question was raised when you brought up 504. I had a student that was speech only, but then ADHD arose and needed accommodations,
Sure.
so couldn't have a 504 and an IEP. So the accommodations were added to my IEP, and I'm thinking, but wait a minute, because the accommodations don't go with her
Sure.
speech impairment. Thank you.
So I'm not going to get in the middle of that one because every state is different. You can have, depending upon where you are, 504 and an IEP, particularly if they are for different areas. One disability does not require specially designed, and the other one does. So, and you know that almost anybody can be 504 because that's just wide open territory. But I guess my concern is not the political compliance part of it. My concern is that the audience for 504 is different than the audience immediately for an IEP. So what I wouldn't want, if I was the building principal, I would say, Melissa, look, you're a speech, whatever you are, speech and hearing therapist, clinician, pathologist, whatever, you answer to it all. Look, focus on the speech and language stuff, and we'll put the accommodations in your IEP, but we need to bring a group of people together to understand the accommodations. I don't want to add that to your job. We'll find a way to do that, but we'll house it in your IEP, but you're not responsible for it.
And
that's
that's what my principal did.
Yeah, that's a good leadership decision. Right.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay. So standards-based instruction with that background. So relative to Melissa's question here. Melissa, right? Yeah. So we have a standard or benchmark aligned to a course description. That's critical. How does the general ed teacher align their instructional lesson plans with the standard? So here is, because we're not going to have time to go through this afternoon, so here is a suggestion or a question. To what degree do you, and everybody like you, so would be maybe a school psychologist if they're doing behavior stuff, a special ed teacher, remedial reading teacher, to what degree do you participate in grade level or subject area PLCs when they write their lesson plans? Do you, and this is and I'm not throwing you under the bus here, these are questions. Is your instruction paced and aligned with Tier 1? The most powerful instruction for struggling kids is pre-teach, review, and reteach. We're going to talk more about this in interventions. But you can choose to have a box. Wilson's Foundations, by the way, is awesome. Dina, it's awesome. What would make it more powerful is if you would use that to teach the skill. Have kids bring their books from general ed, and when you apply the skill, apply it to words that they're going to be reading for next Tuesday. So if you're trying to build vocabulary in kids, don't do it with a vocabulary box. Teach the kids just-in-time vocabulary for what they need for the lesson next week. Because they may be learning wonderful words from you. And I'm just picking you because you asked the question. And they may be, but not the words they need to understand what is occurring next week. And I'll give a quick example. I've given this before. The people here will have to just put up with it for a moment, who have been to my stuff before. So I have a 10-year-old granddaughter. I have 6 grandkids. And how many of you are grandparents? Not many in this room because, yeah, the gray hair, no hair, colored hair people are grandparents. Awesome. And a 7th one is on the way. And I just got a text from that daughter, and I didn't look at it because she's going to be induced on the 16th. And I said, text me if you're going to the hospital. And I didn't want to look at it because I was going to get too excited in here, and I'll get excited at lunch. So my 10-year-old granddaughter is very high achiever, is at a very high-performing school, and she has very high expectations for herself. Everything comes very easily to her. She has no issues. She's at or above grade level in even her worst subject, which is math. But that subject is not as fluent for her, and she has to work harder, and she's more anxious about it because she wants to do as well in math as she does in everything else. That is not going to happen in the long run, but that's not where she is right now. So my daughter called me and said, Addie is, she's struggling in math, and blah, blah, blah. And she said, what can I do? Well, this is my helicopter daughter, so of course she had every book that her kids are in school. The teachers post the lesson plans online so that they can go to see what they're doing next, the page numbers, all of that kind of stuff. So she was just like super helicoptering. And I said, Addie knows math, but what happens is when something is introduced, she gets anxious that she's not going to understand it and then not do well. I said the fastest way to reduce anxiety in kids is to expose them to whatever that environment is ahead of time in some kind of systematic desensitization way. What that means for you is practice the next day's math the night before so that when the teacher puts it up there, she'll go, oh, I know how to do this. In 2 days, it worked. So pre-teaching for any kid is preparing a kid background knowledge for instruction, which is one of the most powerful instructional strategies. And kids that come in with background knowledge are golden. What if they don't? So you got a kid trying to catch up, reeling, and stay up, and it doesn't work. So one of the major functions of people who do remedial and specialized work with kids is to ensure that they have the background knowledge and preparation for a lesson before it happens. And that is got to be built into the pacing of our instruction in special ed in particular. So quickly, I'm going to answer your questions and then we'll take a break. Standards focus on, we already talked about that. They don't focus on that, and they focus on that. We already mentioned that. So here is, here's an example of comprehension standard from kindergarten through grade 12. So I just want you to look at some words in kindergarten. How many of you teach kindergarten, have taught it, have kindergartners like kindergartners? Okay. With prompting and support, retell familiar stories, including key details. Notice the word, that's a really important standard because it says familiar. So if you're assessing that standard, you have got to be sure that the kid is familiar with the content. And what if the kid isn't? Then you have to expose them before you assess them. Because familiar is a key term here. Retell. It doesn't say it has to be verbal. It could be a picture. It could be acted out. And key details. What are the key details? So now let's fast forward. So, Melissa, what pops up here is what is added to each standard. Okay, and you know how to do that, obviously, if you mentioned that. So when we take a look at where the rigor is added, that's important. So let's say that you're at a 5th grade. Determine a theme of a story, drama, or poem from details in the text, including, that's the added part, and then summarizing the text is the same as key details back in kindergarten. So you would have to ask yourself, how can I get the kid to be able to do the blue part, even if it's in the context of an earlier standard? It's a different way of looking at it. Because just because the kid hasn't done something in an earlier standard doesn't mean the kid can't do this. Because we don't know yet. So when standards increase in rigor, but overall the kid's at a lower level, look at what is increased in the rigor and see if you can incorporate that into the lower standard that you're doing. Does that make sense? And often kids can do the higher one, but we assume they can't because they're at a lower level. So I would suggest that as a thought with 1 or 2 kids. See if that strategy works for you. Okay? So I'm going to fast forward here. Look at the 12th grade standard. Determine 2 or more central ideas. What was the kindergarten standard? Retell a familiar story with main ideas. And summary of the text. So here's what I'm saying to you, is that the words in the kindergarten standards are the same words in the 12th grade standards. And if you don't think kindergarten matters, kindergarten sets the foundation for some of the expectations that appear all the way to 12th grade. So as a general education, elementary coordinator, supervisor, curriculum person, right? It is critical that kindergarten teachers understand what their contribution is to 12th grade proficiency. They matter so much. And the standards reinforce that. So one of my concerns, and I hope it's not the case with you, is, and this is for the elementary, you're the only person I heard as being that, so I'm going to keep picking on you. And because you're here, I know you're already doing that, but as you go to your other conferences where the choir is not with you, then you can sing this song. So there should be nothing an elementary coordinator does around curriculum for professional development that doesn't include special education teachers at the table with the general ed people in the moment. Because when we look nationally at how many, before it got all political, how many special education staff were included in district-wide Common Core state standards training, it was almost 0. Because they're special ed people. How do special ed people understand scope and sequence and pacing for their instruction? If you introduce a new reading program, they've got to be at the table. Absolutely. Because that new reading program, maybe you're switching from a dense vocabulary to a distributed vocabulary or something. They now have to know that because you've switched what's happening in the mothership. And all kids have to survive in the mothership because that's where the assessments occur. So any change in curriculum in the district has got to have special ed teachers at the table from day one. Otherwise, we're isolating them in the development of their lesson plans and in IEPs. So here is where we are right now. You have a sheet called Unpacking the Standards. Look at this paper. This is our actual worksheet that we use for unpacking the standards. It's called Standard-Based Tier 3 Instructional Planning. It's one sheet. Looks like this. In this case, it has a standard written at the top. Recount stories including fables, folktales, and myths from diverse cultures. Determine the central message, lesson, or moral, and explain how it's conveyed through key details. I think it's an 8th grade comprehension standard. We then literally have everybody circle the nouns. Circle the nouns right now, quick. And then underline the verbs. So when we do that, our Tier 2, Tier 3, and specially designed people look at this and say, here are the skills my kids can do. Here are the skills they know. Here are the ones that they don't know. We then call those access skills for our IEP development. And our IEP development is going to focus on providing kids the skills that they need to work, to be successful with the standard that is being taught in the classroom where they are 280 out of 330 minutes a day. So the three questions that follow is what access skills, what skills require initial instruction, which ones require strengthening, and what academic behaviors, what we just went through, are going to be necessary for the kid to do this. So we're going to come back to this sheet 2 or 3 times here in the next couple of minutes. So I put this here for you because there is a website, bottom right. It goes to a YouTube embedded video that actually shows the standards being unpacked, and you might choose to use that for professional development or something like that. All right, so at tabletop, I'm going to give you 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes to answer this. If students with disabilities are expected to do well on state assessments, which are based on state standards, it's important to align instruction and intervention with those standards. As you work to facilitate intervention development, how do you align your interventions with standards now? 4 minutes, go. So I was asked a question. We have a kid who can't read. We're focusing on phonological awareness and some phonics and that kind of stuff, right? Yes. To get the kid to be able to decode, basically. Yes. Yes. So how do we deal with the standard for a kid who can't read in an IEP? And I said, the focus of the IEP, the phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, that's awesome. But that isn't a kindergarten standard. The kindergarten standard for comprehension is what I showed you. So fine, that's fine, but put in the IEP that in order to access the standard until fluency develops, this student will have to have text-to-speech or content read to assess the comprehension part of it. That's all you do. Because if you don't put that in the IEP, then they're doing a great job of working on the skill set to access, but no one is responsible for the standard. And in particular, for how does the kid access the standard? I mean, come on, even your Kindle will convert. If you're being lazy, you can turn on the voice on the Kindle. This stuff is easily available to kids. So include the standard when the focus of the IEP is not addressing the standard. And as the person responsible, you could end up putting the general ed teacher with supports from technology or whomever. But you don't want that teacher not working on the standard because the kid can't read words. Does that make sense? Sometimes you have to be careful that the IEP releases a teacher from worrying about an area that goes beyond the IEP. This kid can't read, so we're not going to work on that comprehension standard. What? Same thing with blind kids. We're just going to not tell them where the walls are? I mean, so we have to separate that out. Good. So here's the thing about, we've already gone through that. Universal design is a way to increase access through environmental modifications for kids with disabilities. So we cut curbs, we have wider stalls, we have twittering birds. In Tallahassee in Florida, it drives me crazy. You get to a crosswalk, and the bird is twittering when you can walk across that crosswalk. Well, I can hear the bird also twittering when I can walk across the other crosswalk, which if I walked across this one, I would be run over. So I don't know whether that's for people who don't pay attention, people with attentional issues, or people with visual impairments. I have no idea. But it is a universal design, right? So I'm going to give you an example here and have you practice it with this standard very briefly. So there are 3 principles to universal design. Multiple measures of representation, that's delivery. Multiple means of action and expression, that's the kid's performance. And then multiple means of engagement. recruiting interest, sustaining effort and persistence, and self-regulation. Those are those academic behaviors. However, here's my experience with UDL. If you actively use principles 1 and 2 in organizing your interventions and giving flexibility and performance, now you have a kid who can engage, and the engagement is less of an issue. So 1 and 2 is designed to build engagement into the delivery and performance. So you have on your next slide, here's a third grade standard. Recount stories including fables, folk tales, and myths from diverse cultures, determine the central message of the lesson or moral, and explain how it's conveyed through key details. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and here's what I want you to do first by yourself. I mean individually. I want you to think, for that standard, how are different ways that we could present strategies to engage in what the standard wants? So how do we have kids, different ways to present a fable versus a folk tale or a myth? Would I give a verbal direction? Would I have visuals of what is a fable, a folk tale, or a myth? How are different ways that I could get that across? How are different ways that I could have kids identify a word that's the big idea? Second, how are different ways that kids could show me this? They could verbally say it, could maybe write it. What if we had them draw a picture? What if we had them do visuals and point to which one is fable, folktale, or myth? Okay? And don't worry about the last one for right now. So I want you to come up with at least 2 ways for representation, 2 ways for expression or performance, and then share with your table partners. Go. So one of the things, this is not totally your responsibility. You can ask the teacher, how are different ways that you're going to present this? Here are some ways that these 2 students that I work with might get it. So I'm thinking of an example of a myth, and a teacher showed me some of the lesson stuff. So in myths, they had visuals. Every myth had something in it that wasn't real, because that's a myth. It backfired, because they put a unicorn in a thing. And the kids saw the unicorn and said, I was at the zoo last week and they had 2 of those. So it backfired. But that was an example of how they used a visual to communicate a myth to kids. So you then can say, if somebody said this to you, let's look at a picture of that. Is that real? No, it's not. So if they said that and you know it wasn't real, is that a myth? So those are the kinds of specially designed things that are important. So universal design, your building doesn't, for me, universal design is not whether your building is a universal design for learning building. Universal design are the people thinking in terms of these 3 principles when constructing instruction and interventions. And if everybody's thinking this way, then it is universal design. In some cases, you need the technology. You need text-to-speech. You need a number of things that would help kids. Years ago when I worked here, my wife and I actually directed one of the first programs for students with autism in Northwest Indiana. That program won that year the National Award for Programs for Autistic Students. Got that apple that Paul Newman's wife gave to everybody. And the focus of that program was also around universal design. How do we construct environments where those kids can be successful? So technology was involved significantly. Those kids embraced technology. And so we delivered a lot of stuff through the use of technology. At the time, it was rudimentary technology. But imagine now. So another example is how many of you have kids work on computers, either personalized learning or some kind of computer-assisted instruction? All right. What we know from the Center for Applied Special Technology and the work at the University of Kansas is for ADHD kids, that personalized learning has to be high stimulus, fairly rapid moving. For kids on the spectrum, it has to be predictable, repetitive, and slower moving. So the technology itself, the way instruction is presented, has a strong research base behind it for different disabilities. So if you're doing universal design for a kid on the spectrum, it might involve a different personalized learning program than a kid for ADHD. Does that make sense? And the same thing with instruction delivered not through technology.